Right, let's start with the term. The term is derived from the Greek holocauston, which means sacrifice by fire. And I must say, I'm not saying that because I'm Greek, but that's what happens. I'm not of those Greeks who think that everything derives from Greece, by the way. Anyway, the term started to be used, and that's important, in the late 1950s to describe the member of 6 million Jews under the auspices of the German government and its collaborating institutions. So we usually call it the Holocaust. In recent years, though, the term has increasingly been applied to also non-Jewish victims of Nazi terror, and as I said, homosexuals, Roma, etc. Those deemed not to be fit, and also more widely, it's used metaphorically these days. Now, the Hebrew equivalent of the term Holocaust, which means calamity or disaster, is Shoah. This term is still in circulation. It was first used in the 1960s. There's a great film by Claude Lanzmann called Shoah. Now, another way that we can describe what happened is called genocide, another term. It's a general concept in social theory, any legal theory, any legal practice, denoting the systematic killing of populations based on their ethnic background. And there are other terms as well. For instance, the Nazis used the term Endlösung, which meant final solution. And I'll get to it in a moment. Now, how and why? We've seen throughout history, First World War, even earlier, moments in time when certain states, or even imperial states, are seeking world domination. But what is quite unique here is that this world domination comes with an ideology that stipulates that the only way for a certain regime like the Nazi regime to succeed is to guarantee the total annihilation systematic of a certain population defined in racial terms. How it all happened. The first concentration camp starts early on as Hitler consolidates his power, 1933 in Dachau. By 1939, remember the Kristallnacht I talked about, we have an increased ghettoization to remove Jews from their surroundings, meaning take Jews from the German Jews, right, from the houses they owned, the businesses they owned. They have been deprived of their citizenship by 1939, and put them in ghettos. And what is gripping and striking, and you can see that, for instance, not necessarily in Germany, in other places around Eastern Europe that Germany occupies, such as Prague, is that the ghettos that Jewish populations are put in the 30s are actually places, ancient ghettos where Jews used to live 300, 400, and 500 years ago. And this goes on, points to the broader, history of anti-Semitism in Europe. The ghettos as confined places where Jewish populations had the right to live or were directed to live were not an invention of the Nazis. They are deeply ingrained in European culture. Think of The Merchant of Venice. William Shakespeare is The Merchant of Venice, which takes place at another time. Anyway, let me get back to late 1930s. Thousands of concentration camps used prisoners as a vital labor force, effectively rendering them slaves in factories for the war economy. And this is an essential component of the persecution of the Jews. Cheap labor hands. In the early days of the war, there is a number of Jews are being killed, not necessarily in concentration camps, but by the sheer brutality of the regime. And when the concentration camps proliferate, then we have a specific dedicated force, the SS, being responsible for the killing and the management of the killing. Now, was this the only solution to the Jewish question? As in the early 1940s in Germany, there was another solution that was being examined, and that's to say the forced migration to the African colony of the Jews in Germany and elsewhere, to the African colony of Madagascar. However, these plans were quickly abandoned because the opening of the Soviet front, the Operation Barbarossa, and the radicalization of the war upped the scale for the annihilation and mass murder. The final solution changed, therefore, from vague plans to resettle the Jews to mass annihilation. And the linchpin for that was the so-called Wannsee Conference that takes place in 1942, attended by big names and figures, the top hierarchy of the Nazi Party, where the decision is taken to implement the Endlösung, the final solution, which means the uprooting and systematic destruction of the Jewish populations in Germany and in the parts that the Germans occupied in Eastern Europe that still had a lot of Jewish populations. And this is a map, this is a rather sad map of the concentration and extermination camps and the major euthanasia centers. And as you can see here, there's an interesting concentration of them. They're all around Germany and across Poland. And some of the most lethal ones were in the parts of Poland occupied by the Germans. One of the most iconic concentration camps and is that of Auschwitz. You may have heard of it, you may have read about it. It was opened in 1940. And in a way, Auschwitz kind of is a good example because it shows this function of the camps as, at first, labor spaces, places with bad conditions where people were Jewish, where populations were rounded up from across the places that the Germans occupied and were sent there to work for the industries that would produce all sorts of war materials. And then gradually, this concentration camp became an extermination camp, a camp that those deemed to be not healthy enough or not capable enough to work or whatever were put in gas chambers. And what is creeping in that camp, and I have had the occasion to visit it, and it's really, really, really heartbreaking. And I urge you to get online and see, or if you have the time to go to Poland, whenever we can travel again, it's a great thing to do because it's part of our cultural heritage. A very dark moment is to see that what happens in Auschwitz is that we have a small camp that pretty much looks like a miniature, like a couple of blocks, and then close to it there is a massive open space which used to be a massive camp, but it was obviously bombed after the end of the war, and it showed the plans how big the camp would become and how many people were, as it were, quote unquote, hosted in that annex of it, and then they were all gradually led to be annihilated. So it is a really gripping spectacle. 1.1 million people were murdered there, and the killing continued even in the final days of the war. The camp was liberated by the Soviets in 1944, and horrible scenes and pictures that no one wants to see were released after that. Another one is Treblinka. Feel free to look it up and see more information about it. I have to stress here something that we tend to forget when we talk about concentration camps, that the death camps, like the ones I talk about and I showed, were part of a wider concentration camp universe, stretching all the way from Norway to Greece and Crete. By the end of the war, 1.6 million people were incarcerated in more than 10,000 camps. Some of them were extermination camps, other concentration camps, other ghettos, other psychiatric homes, other labor camps, etc. So it's not simply these camps that were really, really important and did speed up the annihilation of a living population around Europe. It's also all these other camps that the Nazis had planted in all sorts of various places. They were occupied and they fulfilled different functions. This is an image just to give you a sense again of where the ghettos were. The ghettos where the Jewish population were kept in before then sent to the various camps. And I should also mention here, we have different kinds of forms of practices of mass murder. Pogroms, especially in Germany and Eastern Europe, meaning state-sanctioned violence. We have imprisonments in concentration camps. 2 million died in concentration camps alone. We have the ghettos. We have shootings by Geth Squad. And who was involved in the Holocaust? We had branches of the German government, as I said earlier, directly involved. Very important thing, and sometimes it gets missed, we have branches of other occupied by the Axis European governments and local civil servants and militias, for instance, in southern and eastern Europe. What I mean to say, it was not only the SS that would take Jews and put them in concentration camps. In the various different parts of Europe that the Nazis occupied, they had placed, as it were, planted different regimes, and those regimes sometimes who were collaborating regimes, were even more ruthless in the persecution and destruction of Jews. Such is, for instance, the case of Hungary. German industry had a key role to play on bringing about the Holocaust, and kind of other factors as well. And I want to give you a tangible example to just get you to imagine the scale of annihilation. And here I will draw from the Greek example. Greece, as I said earlier, was occupied by the Nazis. The condition in Greece was really bad. There was some minimal, there was indeed a resistance. The resistance was not effective on the military end of things, but it created the cause for, but it was kind of led by left wings and people and socialists. They flew in the mountains of Greece and they created an alternative government. And that later on led to the Greek Civil War after the end of the war, because we had, Greece, as we shall see later, kind of came to be one of the frontiers of the Cold War. But for the purposes of what I want to do today, forget all this and just focus on one thing. We have the second city of Greece right now, the second biggest city of Greece, Thessaloniki. It's in the north of Greece. Used to have a thriving population of Greek Jews before the Second World War. 52,000 of them. 16 synagogues, 20 schools. From these 52,000 people, 45,000, do the maths, were transported to Auschwitz in 1943. And to this day, only 5% of the city's population has survived the Holocaust. I think this goes on to show, and people refer to this particular place in Greece city as the city of ghosts. This goes on to show the magnitude of destruction that the European Jews suffered in places that may not have been within proper Germany, but they were occupied by Germany. How did the world react to the final solution? Foreign governments in the Axis orbit, as I said earlier, they cooperated in the deportation of Jewish refugees. French, Slovak, Croats, they transported Jewish populations to concentration camps. Some regimes were equally enthusiastic, not more to facilitate, they were equally enthusiastic to facilitate the annihilation of the Jews. And this is the case of Romania and Hungary. Other regimes, the collaborationist government in Greece kind of dragged their heels. However, in Thessaloniki, there was actually direct Nazi rule, not in the rest of Greece, and that made it easier for the transportation of Jews there. Denmark, I shall say, was pretty much the only collaborator regime that actively did something to help Jews to escape. How about the Allies? The British and Americans knew but little was done. Historians still argue whether the inaction was a result of anti-Semitism, inability to imagine the scale of the catastrophe. And I have to mention here that the final solution was never a concern of the war effort, sadly. How about the Germans? There's a lovely debate on this. There's two positions at this time that's been discussed all through from the 80s onwards. Encapsulated by these two books, Ordinary Men or Hitler's Willing Executioners. A book published in the early 1990s explored the German police battalion, a German police battalion, terrorizing Jewish ghettos and massacring Jewish men. So the author Browning concludes that German soldiers killed out of peer pressure and fear of authority, not necessarily out of ideological conviction. And the author argues that there was nothing unique about the German culture or anti-Semitism that led them to commit the massacres. Now, other authors have contrasted this claim, and they have actually claimed the opposite, that the virulent form of anti-Semitism that became the cultural norm in Germany gave rise to, as it were, pervasive ideology, which effectively rendered even ordinary Germans during the Nazi period to just be prepared to kill Jews. So these are two positions that are still being discussed in Germany with regard to what extent were the German people, as it were, culpable of what happened. And then another related debate is that between that you probably know more about, functionalism and intentionalism. Was the Holocaust a product of systematic planning? Does the initiative lie with the Führer alone or with the state bureaucracy? The functionalists tend to focus on institutions, systems, and processes. The intentionalists study more motivations, psychology, individual choices. And I think I should kind of end here on this note. These debates about responsibility and about how to explain what happened are still raging as we speak. What is important to remember is, and that goes on, and this is an image from Auschwitz after it was liberated, and from a couple of years ago when some remaining survivors went and visited the place. What is important to remember is the role that the key role that the Holocaust has in European culture. The systematic annihilation of a population that belonged to Europe in as much as any other population has created a deep trauma in European societies. And I think it's befitting to end this, to pause this segment here.